Good morning, church. Good to see you. I know we have some visitors here this morning, so we are thankful that you are here and hope this service is a blessing to you. And we hope, if you can, that you can stick around and we can get a chance to meet you, get to know you a little bit better. What do you do when you have been wrong? Do you try to get back at somebody? Do you get angry? Do you get bitter? Or do you forgive? We've been going through and talking about suffering. Last week we talked about some of the highs and lows, those peaks and valleys of life. And sometimes hard things can come through that, negative things can come through those moments in life. But sometimes, maybe for some of us, even many times, the difficulties and the sufferings that we go through don't come from the ups and downs of life, but they come as a direct result of the people in our life. That sometimes people around us, maybe even our friends and family, are the ones who hurt us and cause us suffering. So where is the lemonade for those of us who have been wronged? We're going to look at the story of a very familiar person in the Bible. We're going to look at the story of Joseph. We're going to start there in Genesis 45. And I'll bring you up to speed on this. Joseph is now growing, and he's risen to this point where he is second in command in all of Egypt. He's a very prominent, very important man. And Genesis 45 is the time where he sees his brothers for the first time. They see him for the first time as well. He doesn't quite reveal who he is at first. And so this is a moment, because if you remember Joseph's story, he's sold into slavery. His brothers don't like him. They throw him in a pit. They sell him to some slave traders. And Joseph's had a lot of time to think about, what am I going to do if I ever see these guys again? What am I going to do? And most of us might think, well, I'm going to think of some way to get them back, right? We think about this phrase, when life gives you lemons. Some of us say, well, if life gives me lemons and it comes from these people in my life, I'm going to chunk them right back at them, right? Or I'm going to take those lemons and I'm going to squeeze the juice right in their eyes. We think of some nasty way we're going to get back at them. Joseph had plenty of time to think about, what is he going to do when he sees them again? So this is Genesis 45. Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, have everyone go out from me. And so there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. And then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. And they came closer. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. So this is the big reveal. This is me, I'm Joseph. Remember your brother? Here I am. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father, and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen. And you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks, and your herds, and all that you have. And there I will also provide for you. For there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household, and all that you have, will be impoverished. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. And then Joseph fell on his brother's Benjamin's neck, and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers, and wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. So this is the first time that they've been reunited. And Joseph tells them who he is. And he's had plenty of time to think about, what am I going to do when I see these guys again? And you see that he forgives them. He has a different route than maybe what we commonly think of. Because usually our first reaction is, when someone's wronged us, how do I get back at them? And maybe we even get creative with it. We try to scheme and say, well, I'm going to get them back way more than they got me. I'm going to really make it sting. I'm going to really make it hurt. Joseph has plenty of resources. He has the means. He can get creative. There's all kinds of things that he can do to punish his brothers. And he accepts them. Not only that, he says, go and get Jacob. Go and get our father and bring him back here. You guys can all live together with me. So here's the thing I want us to think about in terms of forgiveness this morning. Is that you and I, we cannot choose our circumstances. But we do have a choice when it comes to forgiveness. We can't choose what people do to us. We can't choose how they treat us. We can't choose when people wrong us or not. But we always have the option. We can always choose forgiveness. So if we go back and if we were to look at these things, these negative things, and kind of going with our theme and thinking about these lemons in Joseph's life, he's got a lot. There's a lot of things that are going on that have gone wrong in his life. And so we go back and we look at that story. You remember that story where Joseph has this fancy coat, this coat of many colors, we often call it, and his brothers are jealous, and that's one thing, but really what gets them really riled up is the fact that he has these dreams. And he says, I'm gonna be in this prominent position, and these dreams, you guys bow down to me. And they go, that will never happen. So they're kind of furious at him for all these things. He's a favorite of Jacob, but he's also saying, at some point, you guys are going to bow down to me. Right? And you don't want to hear your brother or your sister ever tell you that you're going to bow down to them. And so they're upset. And so they hate him. They have plans to kill him. And they say, well, let's not kill him. They throw him in a pit. He's sold into slavery. And this is how he ends up in Egypt. He's sold to some slave traders. So things are just not going well for Joseph. And then he gets to Egypt, and just when we think that he's kind of getting back on his feet, and things are going well for him again, he's kind of moving up in power, then we have Potiphar's wife who falsely accuses him, and because he is falsely accused, he is then thrown into prison. So he's got a lot of stuff that's happened against him, a lot of lemons in his life. And yet I want us to see something that happens during this story as he's going through all these negative things. So in Genesis 39, this is the chapter where he's falsely accused and he's thrown into prison. The chapter starts with this phrase. And it's actually said twice in the chapter. He says it in Genesis 39 and verse 2. The text says, the Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. There's that key phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. And then he goes through all these things right after this verse. He's falsely accused, he's thrown into prison, he's finally gotten out of this past, he's risen up to these great heights, only to be thrown down again. And then at the very end of that, after he's been thrown into prison, that phrase comes back and we see it repeated again in verse 21. It says, the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And so in between verse 2 and 21, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens to Joseph. And yet, the text reminds us, God was with Joseph the entire time. Good and bad, God was with him. And we see that Joseph is faithful to God throughout all of these ordeals. He knows, God is with me. God is the one who got me to these heights. I've risen to great power. And even when I'm down in the depths and I'm in prison, even then, God is still with me. And I'm still going to be faithful to him and to serve him. Joseph stays faithful despite being wrong. So then we flash forward a few chapters at the very end of Genesis, in Genesis 50. Again, Joseph is with his brothers in this setting. The only thing, it's a very notable thing that has changed, is now Jacob has died. And so the brothers kind of get this idea, like, well, maybe Joseph was just playing nice because Dad was still around, and we had to go back home and bring him to Egypt and all that. But Dad's not here now, so maybe Joseph is really going to take it out of us. They're a little worried, they're a little concerned now that Jacob is not around. Notice this interaction that Joseph has with them. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" I think that's a very good thought there. It's a credible thought. It's logical to think, well, okay, maybe now Joseph's really going to come after us. And so they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father charged before he died, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, Please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and your sin, for they did you wrong. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him." But notice his reaction. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, this is a key phrase in Joseph's story, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. And so therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And so he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So here he's had two chances. He's had two opportunities to fight back, to retaliate, to get his revenge. And both times, Joseph chooses to accept them and to forgive them. He takes the higher path. He could have gotten really creative. There's all kinds of things that he could have done, especially someone in his position. And he refrains from that. And he says, you notice the wisdom. Notice how much Joseph has grown up over these last several years and going across all these chapters in Genesis. He's really matured, and he says, you meant to do this evil to me, but God's bringing something good out of this. And I think there's something in that for us as well. That sometimes, even when people hurt you and people wrong you, if we handle it the right way, and we're trying to reconcile that relationship, and we're trying to forgive, and we're trying to build bridges instead of tearing them down, even then, God can make something good of those things that we've gone through, those hurts. And so you see, he has the opportunity, and he chooses forgiveness. You can't always choose what happens to you, but you do have a choice in whether or not you're going to forgive that person. We go into the New Testament and we see this command. We obviously know as Christians, as followers of Christ, we are called to do this, to forgive. And I'm not going to suggest to you or tell you that it's easy, that it's always convenient, that it's just cut and dry. It's sometimes messy and ugly and hard. You know that if you've had to forgive somebody from your past, somebody who's hurt you. Forgiveness is not an easy thing. And yet, we are called to do that as followers of Christ. So Paul will say in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, he says, "Be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you." You notice that qualifier there, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. That's the way that you're to forgive. Very similar, isn't it, to the way what he says about love in John 13? He says, don't just love one another, love as I have loved you. That's a big difference. And so he says, you're to love others the way that I have loved you. And now, when the subject of forgiveness comes up, same idea. You are to forgive others the way that Christ has forgiven you. And then in one of those passages that we really wish Jesus hadn't said, but he did, Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. "If you forgive those who sin against you, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But notice, if you refuse to forgive others, your Father will not forgive your sins." We are called to be forgiving people. And we're not exempt from forgiveness and forgiving other people just because things are difficult or hard. In fact, we might be called to forgiveness more in those moments. Because oftentimes that's the only thing that's going to save that relationship. We are called to forgive. So an application for us this morning, we need to be faithful even when we are wrong. We see this in Joseph's story. He goes through all of these things. He has all these things happen to him. Just one thing after another, one limit after another, and he stays faithful to God. He keeps being faithful to him, and he's following him, and he knows no matter if I'm up high or I'm down low, whether I'm second in command or I'm in prison, God is still with me. God is still watching. He is wanting to see how I'm going to live out my faith, and Joseph stays faithful to God. And so even when we are wrong, even when we go through hard times and people have hurt us,
maybe they've slandered us, maybe they've embarrassed us, maybe they've hurt us in some other way, we need to understand you are still called to be faithful. You're not off the hook for being faithful to God just because somebody has hurt you. You are still to be faithful. And also, along with that, you're not off the hook to forgive either. And so don't let those past hurts make you bitter. You've heard that phrase, maybe you've heard that phrase where people say, you know, you can either let a situation make you better, or you can let it make you bitter. We have a choice in that. And so when these things happen to us, are we going to hold a grudge? Are we going to bear a grudge? Are we going to make it worse for us? Because by the way, when you don't forgive, the only person that hurts is you. So are you going to forgive, or are you going to let that bitterness build up in your heart? We need to make sure that we're not letting those past hurts keep us from being who we need to be now. And also, we need to remember this point that forgiveness, as I said, isn't supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to be easy. That's why it is so difficult. It is hard. But if you think about it, remember how he says there in Ephesians 4, Paul says, forgive just as Christ has forgiven you. Man, it would be really hard to forgive us, right? Enemies of God is what Paul says. We're not easy to love. We're not easy to forgive either. And God has forgiven us. And so, as an extension of that, you should be able to. You should go out and forgive those who hurt you. It's not supposed to be easy, but I think it's also good to remember this phrase that we saw there in Genesis 39. God is with you. I know it's tough. I know it's hard to forgive those people that have hurt you in your life, but God is with you during that process, and you can do difficult things. You can do hard things like forgiving those who hurt you. And you can do it because God is with you, and He can give you the strength to go through that. How many of you have read that book, The Count of Monte Cristo? Okay. Mandy told me that she read this in high school. I guess growing up in Altus High School, we had different standards for what we read and what we didn't read. But I don't remember reading it. I have seen the movie. Now, the movie's a little bit different, and you know that phrase they say, don't judge a book by its, well, that's close, don't judge a book by its movie. Sometimes the movie and the book are very much different. So I'm going to share with you the movie side of things. I don't know the book as well. But in this movie, we have this guy, Edmond Dantes. And his best friend is a guy named Ferdinand Mondego. And Edmond Dantes is engaged to a girl named Mercedes. Things are looking well for Edmond. And his best friend, I'm just going to give you the Cliff Notes version, Ferdinand throws Edmond into prison. He betrays his friend. He throws him into prison. Mainly he wants to steal Edmund's girl, and so he throws him into prison. And so Edmund is in prison, and while he is there, he learns that the person who threw him in prison is none other than his best friend. He learns the real truth of how he got there, and then he also, as he's talking to this elderly man, he finds out that there is a treasure that's buried off in this remote island. And so, over time, they're able to kind of organize a prison break. And Edmund is going to get out of prison. One of the last things he asks, right before he runs off in this prison break, is he asks this old man, he says, where is this treasure exactly? And so he gets out of prison. Edmund goes with another friend that escaped from prison. They go to this remote island. They find this treasure. And we're talking about chest after chest after chest of treasure. The boats are kind of sinking because they got so much treasure on the boat. The weight of it is just weighing it down. And so now this guy, he's gone from being in prison. It's kind of like Joseph's story in a way. He's gone from being really, down in the depths, here he is in prison. And now he's one of the richest guys in all of France. And he shows up, and everybody's like, wow, who's this guy? And I think it's kind of funny also, I'll mention this, in the movies, really the only difference is he grows a mustache, but somehow they still don't recognize him. But he shows up, and he's got all these fancy clothes, and like, who is this guy? He's wooing everybody over, they're all impressed with him, and they're like, wow, this guy's great, he throws great parties, he's got a lot of money he throws around to everybody. And he goes throughout this process, and the whole time, this whole idea, he takes on this identity, this alter ego of the Count of Monte Cristo. So now he's no longer Edmund, he is the Count of Monte Cristo. And his whole plan, ever since he got out of prison, is I'm going to get back those people who hurt me and threw me into prison. Mainly his friend Mondego. And so that's his goal. And so he seeks him out. He finds Mercedes. He finds out Mercedes now has a son, which, to kind of further complicate it, that son is with his best friend. And so now he has this moment where he's going to go and try to confront him. Hey, you're the guy who threw me into prison. You were supposed to be my best friend. And so they have a good old-fashioned sword fight, and he ends up killing Ferdinand Mondego. And so he's done it. He's finally done it. This was his plan the entire time. He got rich, he got all this money, he's got the means to go after this guy and to find him. He does, he kills him, and he's not happy about it. You find out, Albert, who is the son, finds out, hey, this is Edmond Dante's account. You know this account? He's your real dad. And so Edmund's reunited, and he gets back with Mercedes, and now he has this son, who he is the biological father of. And so everybody is, it seems like a really nice way to end the movie. Everybody's back together. And he actually goes and he uses that money to buy the prison that he was imprisoned in. He actually buys that land. And they say, well, are you going to tear this prison down now that it's, now that you own it? He says, no, I'm going to keep it up. Because it's a reminder of where I've been and where I've come from. But then he says, this whole thing, this whole revenge, plot and path, all the way to killing his best friend. He said, I plotted this, and I plotted this, and I sat in that prison cell thinking, if I ever get out, this is what I'm going to do. And I did it, and it wasn't working. At the end of it all, he's rich, he's reunited with his family, everything is good, and yet he feels empty and hollow inside because he says the revenge just was not worth it. I spent all this time and all this money and all these resources to get back at this one person who caused me harm and that made things worse. Now he has regrets that he's gone this far with his revenge. So sometimes, like Joseph, you make the right choice. You're hurt, people have hurt you, and you take the high path and you forgive them. Sometimes you're like the Count of Monte Cristo, where you want to get back at them, and you do, and you go after it, and you seek it, and you get that revenge, and you realize it wasn't worth it. We don't get to choose what happens to us in life. We are going to have people that have hurt us. If they haven't hurt you in the past, they will probably hurt you in the future. Maybe your very own friends, and maybe your family, maybe the people closest to you. And we can't choose those circumstances. We can't choose what happens to us and how people are going to treat us. But we do have a choice when it comes to how we're going to handle it and how we're going to react. We always have a choice to offer forgiveness. So I simply want to leave you with that challenge and with that encouragement. If you have a relationship, a severed relationship, or somebody that you need to reconcile with, make this week be the week. Pick up the phone, call them, go visit them if you can. If that person is no longer living or they're not around, at least make forgiveness in your heart. Start building bridges. Choose forgiveness. So I want to leave you with that encouragement and that challenge. Choose the higher path. Choose forgiveness. God has forgiven us and all of our mistakes in our past. And He calls us, His people, to do the same, to be forgiving people. So this week, choose forgiveness.